Sometimes it's hard to come up with your own ideas, and there is no shame in that. As a veteran D&D player, I have some advice. Just use another character as a jumping off point. A lot of my player characters have started with existing characters as inspiration. So here's how to make Inspector Javert, or a character like him, in D&D 5th edition. Okay, so let's start off with race and background. Javert's background is pretty important to the thematic interpretations of him. His mother is a fortune teller, and his father is a convict from the galleys. He's from the forgotten underbelly of society, and sees the worst that humanity is capable of very early in his life. He grows up uneducated, but is raised around the prison system. He sees the law as absolute, and believes that people can never change. Maybe it's because of his father's status as a convict, maybe it's because he was exposed to criminals without knowing why they committed their crimes as a young boy, but the end result is a black and white worldview that bends to the absolute authority of law. Joining the police is Javert's way of escaping poverty and wretchedness, but by elevating his own status, he actively makes the situation for the poor worse. Okay, working with this, we have a couple different options for race. Human is a given. That's always going to be open for any type of character. Just for gameplay purposes, I would go for variant human, but that won't be important until we discuss feats. The rest of the races are pulled from the more, quote, monstrous races in the player's handbook. I decided to do this because internalized classism accounts for a lot of Javert's ideals and actions. Internalized racism, too, if you count his mother being a fortune teller as Javert being half Roma. Characters of these races often struggle against the negative stigmas around them and are faced with the choice to either rebel against the system or adhere to it as a self-defense mechanism. Javert scorns his past and the people he came from, and has such a blind trust in the system that perpetuates his own suffering that he would do morally questionable but still legal things to uphold it. Added bonus, all of these races bar human can see in the dark, and therefore his eyes would possess, quote, the feline phosphorescence of night birds. Just like in the novel. And come on, that's a perfect fit. Drow, dark elf, or half-drow is definitely a possibility, since they are basically, and I'm using quotes again here, evil elves. It helps that their place of origin, the Underdark, is literally a weird underground cave country. It would be kinda cool, since in the novel, Victor Hugo constantly juxtaposes the upper and lower classes by using imagery of underground places, the sewers being the city under the city and an escape from the oppression of Paris above, for example. I prefer some of the other options I've compiled, since Javert isn't really the refined sort of guy, and all elves are associated with knowledge and some level of sophistication. But if you're a fan of the gameplay of an elf, it works great. Half-orc is also a solid choice. It helps that orcs are commonly thought of as ugly, since Javert is described in the book as, quote, a dog son of a wolf with a human face. Youch. The violent nature of most orcs in fantasy also conveys some aspects of Javert's brutality. He purposefully intimidates and plays mind games with Valjean when he locates him in the novel, despite the fact that it causes him to lose the trail. Half-orc is a good option, but in my opinion, it does not hold a candle to tieflings. Much like the other, quote, monstrous races, these funky half-demons hold the same thematic implications for Javert. But I would go for a tiefling because A, they're cool, there's a reason they're the most popular race to play in the game, and B, there's this concept in lore called a virtue name. It gets like one sentence in the player's handbook, but for some tieflings, they disavow their birth name and choose a name that signifies a virtue or a concept they aim to uphold. This process of reinvention just matches up with Javert so well, and I think it's hilarious to have his name literally be first name Inspector, last name Javert. Being a cop is the main pillar of his entire identity, and the virtue name takes that into account amazingly. The race is also super customizable, so you could adapt it to a lot of forms of gameplay. I won't spend as much time on backgrounds. I mean, being entirely honest here, my character's background has almost never affected my gameplay. But it's a great character building tool and a way to get some good variation out of a character for different campaign settings. Your background selection mostly denotes what the most important experience was for your character in the past. Don't be afraid to play around with backgrounds that don't traditionally fit with your character's class, just have fun with it. Let's go over a couple options quickly. Urchin is a bit of a stretch, but you could definitely say that Javert was shaped by poverty as a child. If you're trying to play into the more sneaky, spy-like aspects of a D&D playstyle, it's a great one to go with. Soldier is also a given. One could define the police as a paramilitary force on account of their ranking system, weapons carrying, and emphasis on obeying authority. It even says in the player's handbook that being a standing member of the town guard counts. It's a pretty basic background, and I'd argue that the tool proficiencies don't fit Javert at all, but everything else is great. Okay, so interesting sidebar about the French prison system at the turn of the 19th century. It was run out of boats. The galley prison system essentially meant that the government could repurpose naval ships to make inescapable floating prison vessels. In the book, Valjean manages to fake his death after rearrest by diving off of one to save a guard, then pretending to drown. It's a super interesting fact that not a lot of adaptations take full advantage of, and I think that's a crime. With Javert's experience doing manual labor as a child on the galleys and as a guard, it would make sense for him to have some sort of seafaring ability. It's not what you'd immediately associate with Inspector Javert, but it's an interesting alternate direction for you to take your own inspiration from. What would have happened if Javert stayed at sea? Could he fight off a bunch of pirates? Both burning questions that need to be answered. If you're planning on playing a water-based campaign of some sort, this is perfect. The background that would take the most modification to work, yet somehow fits the best, in my humble opinion, is the acolyte. In the actual player's handbook, the acolyte is solely used to describe somebody who lives a religious, monastic lifestyle. For Javert, though, his police work is his religion. At points in the book, he's shown to be vaguely Catholic in terms of, actual religion, but even then, it's mostly in reference to his dedication to unquestionably following authority, like the fact that he believes that nuns physically can't lie. He already lives like a monk, a simple lifestyle devoid of creature comforts, has no family or friends, and follows a specific creed in the service of a higher power, in this case the law. It succinctly describes most of his past, but also encompasses his lifestyle when the events of the plot reach him. In terms of gameplay modifications, I would swap out the religion skill for investigation and possibly give him a tool or weapon proficiency of some kind. Okay, now for the good stuff. Class. I'll go from the options I like the least to the options that fit Javert the best, in my humble opinion. Starting with the cleric. Now, it's not my favorite interpretation of him, but clerics are such stupidly powerful spellcasters that I thought I'd offer the option. If your party's being annoying about needing a healer, but you've got Category 5 Les Mis brain rot like I do, you could go for this. I did already talk about how Javert's perspective on his police work lends a quasi-religious type of feeling to his character that translates to DnD, so the class isn't entirely out of left field. For subclass, I would absolutely go for knowledge. It's the closest in his function as a spy, with domain spells like Scry and Legend Lore, as well as spells like Suggestion and Command, which reflect his position of authority and the way he tends to wield his power over other characters, like Fantine. In a similar vein, we have the Paladin class. This tends to fit better as they have heavier armor proficiencies that allow them to get out on the front lines as a combatant. From a narrative standpoint, the Paladin also swears an unbreakable oath to an ideal to gain their powers. The consequences for becoming an oathbreaker vary from DM to DM, but often if this happens, the player is going for a story where their character betrays their ideals and is driven to madness. The concept of oath-breaking is a one-to-one analogy for Javert's suicide. He betrays his ideals, realizes that his entire life was built on a lie, and can't live with the fact that instead of eliminating evil, he embodies it. Since the general class fits so well, there are a lot of subclasses that work. I'd say, if you're trying to lean into the subjugation aspect of the way Javert carries out the law, Oath of the Crown is a good subclass. Their oath centers on following the law, taking personal responsibility for their actions, and being loyal to their cause. The domain spells focus on compelling enemies into one-on-one fights to draw fire from the rest of the party, and forcing enemies to obey certain commands. So it's a good choice. I did consider the Oath of Devotion, but besides it being in a fitting class, the oath itself felt a little goody-goody for Javert. Some of the tenets are on screen. His motivation for enforcing the law is not necessarily only to do good in the traditional sense. He represents the more vengeful side of the law, the, quote, bulldog providence of society, a force of wrath released on his own class by society to subjugate them. Hey, speaking of, that is exactly what the Oath of Vengeance is. Isn't that funny? While the other oaths focus on doing good deeds or protecting the law, vengeance focuses on the more violent aspects of it. Javert, who represents that type of punishment and enforcement, fits. I mean, just listen to some of these oath tenets. Fight the greater evil, no mercy for the wicked, by any means necessary. I mean, come on. It's perfect. As an added bonus, the domain spells emphasize the hunt and the pursuit of evil. As a vengeance paladin, Javert would get Hunter's Mark, Haste, Hold Person, and Scrying. It's perfect. It's perfect! Victor Hugo probably had a copy of the Player's Handbook right next to him while he was writing Les Miserables. Don't even get me started on the College of Eloquence Bard and the Enjolras parallels. We will be here all night. There's another option. An option that is slightly bonkers. Okay, I'm either insane or a genius, perhaps both. You are not ready for this one. Great Old One Warlock, hear me out, hear me out. The style and aesthetic of Eldritch Horror is a lot bigger than just tentacles and creepy old houses on Cape Cod. The actual horror of it all is being unwittingly forced to bend to a will that's not your own. It's realizing your insignificant place in the world, and that knowledge that nothing you do can ultimately change anything. This realization is like if you took an ant and somehow gave it a comprehensive knowledge of how computers work, then forced it to return to an anthill. Its mind would just break. The knowledge of how the world truly works, how it's all out of the individual's control, how they are completely and utterly complicit in whatever encroaching threat or apocalypse lurks in the background of the story, that's what drives them insane. Eldritch Horror is super effective when it's used as an allegory for society, since it revolves around the idea of powerlessness. The Great Old One is about serving that encroaching terror in an unintentional way. In the book, Javert's realization of the true nature of the justice system is what drives him to suicide. In a way, you could consider realizing that about the justice system in the early 19th century as eldritch knowledge, if you consider the law itself as his patron. The thing about Javert in the book is that though he is cruel in his pursuit of justice, he still ultimately believes he's doing something good. The knowledge that he is not, that the law isn't good or moral, that the law as it is and his enforcement of it made society worse, that is what breaks him. In D&D, warlocks swear an oath similar to paladins, but with tenets completely written by the player and DM. To play Javert as a Great Old One Warlock, I'd suggest just using paladin tenets as general terms of the oath and working on other more specific requirements with your DM. Or you could make him a ranger with his favorite enemy being poor people. You could do that. Really quick, here's a list of feats that fit Javert's character in the book, though since I see stats and feats as more of a gameplay thing than a character writing thing, I'm not covering it in depth. Quite honestly, you could play Javert or a character inspired by Javert as any class through the use of creative what-if questions. What if Javert never joined the police force? Rogue Javert. What if he had to live with himself after betraying all his morals instead of jumping into the Seine? Oathbreaker Javert? Hell, what if he could talk to bees? Swarmkeeper Javert! Bloodhunter Javert would be insanely cool, too. Most of the characterization is in spontaneous roleplay, so I think any variation could fit. I mean, that's the beauty of the game. Do whatever you want. Oath of Vengeance Paladin exists, but a lot of players have a motivation related to hunting down someone specific, completely divorced from their class. I just went for the most thematically relevant and or true to canon classes. Do whatever you feel like. If you decide to create a character like this, or want me to write 2,500 words about how you can make some other character in D&D, let me know in the comments. And to my English teacher, hi, I hope you liked the video. Okay, bye.